Okay, members, can I just welcome and thank very much Anne Cadwallader from the Pat Finucane Centre, Margaret Irwin from Justice for the Forgotten, and Mike Ritchie and Paul Butler from Relatives for Justice. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And as I had said earlier, this is the first in a series of meetings in regards to legacy issues, and I'd just like to welcome and thank those that are in the public gallery as well that have joined us. So I'm going to pass over to Anne. Do you want to start? And then we'll maybe move on to Margaret, Paul and Mike, and then we'll take questions together. Actually, sorry, before you start, I have to go to the notice for privilege before I forget. So I just must remind members of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or body outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009. Witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Joint Committee. If they are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of their evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and they are asked to respect the parliamentary practice that, where possible, they should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. So, Anne, if you'd like to start, thanks very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Firstly, thank you very much to the committee for inviting the Pat Finucane and the others of us here today. The primary work of our centre is to help any family that wishes to find out more about why, how and who was responsible for their bereavement or injury, whether that be physical or psychological. We profoundly believe that families have a right to know as much as is now possible about their loss or injury. It's a very basic human right to be accorded the dignity that only truth and justice can confer. As President Higgins told us on a recent visit to the Aris, to be forgotten is to die twice. While this is important for individual families, it goes far further. If someone was killed, as we now know they were, by perpetrators working for the state, using weapons also originating from state armories, families need to know why and how there was such a breakdown in what they legitimately expect from their government. If I can make a reference here to one family in particular, the family of John Pat Cunningham, a vulnerable adult shot in the back and killed by heavily armed soldiers as he ran away from them in fear. That family has had to listen to some British politicians and newspapers calling for what amounts to an amnesty for people who killed Irish citizens while wearing the uniform of the British Army. Even worse, the victim's family has witnessed some of these same ex-British soldiers blaming them for having the audacity to allow John Pat out of the house on the day he was killed. We do not limit ourselves, however, to working for the victims of state perpetrators. The Pat Finucane Centre believes all parties to the conflict, including paramilitaries, both loyalist and Republican, abused human rights. Our services as researchers and advocates are open to anyone, whatever their politics, national identity or religious belief, in total confidence. We profoundly believe that a better understanding of the reasons for conflict can only be beneficial for wider society as we step into the future. Moving on to where we stand today. Lawyers acting for families represented by the Pat Finucane Centre and Justice for the Forgotten won a landmark legal victory at the end of July in Belfast High Court. The court recognised that the now-defunct Historical Inquiries team had pledged to write a thematic report on state collusion in what has now become known as the Glenanne series of murders, 120 victims, including the 34 people murdered in Dublin and Monaghan in May 1974. The court found there had been extreme unfairness and that the Police Service of Northern Ireland had undermined the HET's pledge. The family's concerns on collusion, said the court, are compounded by the PSNI suppression of the HET report, which had been 80% written when it was stopped in its tracks. 2 decades ago, said the court, the British government had committed itself to putting in place a so-called package of measures to recognise its commitment to the basic principles underlying the European Convention on Human Rights. It was a matter of grave concern, said the court, that the Chief Constable of the PSNI, in suppressing the HET thematic report on Glenanne, had dismantled and abandoned those principles. The judge said there's now a real risk that this will fuel in the minds of the families the fear that the state has resiled from its public commitments because it is not genuinely committed to addressing unresolved concerns of state involvement. This directly affects dozens of families south of the border, as well as north, and discussions are now underway between lawyers for the families and the British state to agree how to remedy this egregious wrong inflicted on families. The Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland, Dr Michael Maguire, is currently heading that office's largest ever investigation to date into the Glenanne series of 120 murders. Other families are on a very long waiting list, however, before they can expect the Ombudsman to investigate their concerns. I include here a chart showing how very poorly the Ombudsman is funded. You can barely see the section that relates to the Ombudsman, and even smaller is the section relating to legacy. This has wider implications for more than the families patiently waiting for inquiries. The Ombudsman's powers were a significant part of the proposals encouraging cross-community confidence in new policing arrangements and part of the agreed package of measures. How can the fact that a mere 0.2% of the overall criminal justice budget being spent on legacy inquiries encourage that confidence? It can't and it doesn't. These problems are infecting the new policing arrangements with the diseases of the past. On top of this, the inquest system in Northern Ireland has now effectively collapsed. The Lord Chief Justice, Sir Dermot Morgan, has produced a business model showing it will cost £10 million to fund the 56 outstanding inquests into 98 deaths, only one of which is due for listing, and even that won't be till next year. The DUP leader, Arlene Foster, is facing a legal challenge for allegedly blocking Sir Declan's plan after she confirmed in a BBC interview she would not allow it to proceed because, as she put it, she doesn't consider enough innocent victims are on the list. How is all of this improving the prospect of reconciliation and power sharing? Quite aside from the devastating impact on families desperate to resolve the deep anxieties still dominating their lives. London cannot be allowed to abdicate its responsibilities or use the power-sharing executive at Stormont as cover for its failures. The executive, unlike Westminster, is not a party to the European Convention and made no commitment in relation to the package of measures. London's breach of the Convention's ban on torture is also unresolved. This goes right back to the 1970s, where the then Taoiseach Jack Lynch raised concerns with his opposite number, Edward Heath. We know that the Department of Foreign Affairs has raised new evidence on waterboarding with the Northern Ireland office at Westminster, but Westminster has failed to investigate, although uniquely under international law there is never any possible justification for torture and no statute of limitations. Aside from the legal process, there is obviously a political one. James Brokenshire, the Northern Secretary of State, is expected to announce a full consultation on implementing the Stormont House Agreement legacy proposals starting in November this year. If this goes ahead, and there's no reason why it shouldn't, as it doesn't require cross-party approval in Belfast, we would encourage the government here, the political parties represented in this committee, and indeed anyone interested, to become full participants. Please don't wait for someone else to respond to the consultation. It is the PFC's contention that given the lack of resources for inquests and the police ombudsman, the lack of independence of the PSNI's legacy investigation branch, the failure to implement the Stormont House Agreement and the failure to complete the HET report into Glenanne, the package of measures agreed between London and Europe is now non-existent. Finally, it was fully 3 years ago that Niels Muiznieks, the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights, said on a visit to Belfast that the UK government cannot wash its hands. These are the most serious human rights violations. Until now, there has been virtual impunity for state actors involved, and I think the government has a responsibility to uphold its obligations under the European Convention, to fund investigations and to get the results. The issue of impunity, he said, is a very, very serious one, and the UK government has a responsibility to uphold the rule of law. This is not just an issue of dealing with the past, it has to do with upholding the law in general. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Anne. Margaret.
Thank you, Chairperson, for inviting Justice for the Forgotten here today. I think most of you here are familiar with our organisation, but very briefly, for those who are not, Justice for the Forgotten was formed in 1996, initially to represent and support the bereaved families and survivors of the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. However, we now also support the families of other bomb attacks, including the Dublin bombings of 1972 and 73, as well as the Belturbet, Dundalk and Castleblaney bombings. We also represent the families of the Miami show band and several families whose relatives were killed in single incident attacks. Our advocacy services are available to anyone bereaved or injured as a result of the conflict in this jurisdiction, regardless of political or religious affiliation. And since 2010, we have been affiliated to the Pat Finucane Centre. You have very kindly invited us here to provide an update on where we stand today regarding victims' issues. The most tragic and continuing legacy of the conflict is the impact on families and communities of the loss of life of family members and friends and the injuries and trauma suffered by survivors. This loss is compounded enormously by the failure to provide information on how and why these loved ones died or were wounded. We advised you in January 2014, nearly 4 years ago, that there had been no compliance by the British government with the motions passed unanimously by Dáil Éireann in 2008 and 2011. And since then, a third motion was passed in May 2014 to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the Dublin Monaghan bombings, and public calls were made by President Higgins, by the former Taoiseach and the former Minister for Foreign Affairs. But the British authorities have felt comfortable in continuing to ignore the requests of a sovereign parliament. A year has passed since the former Taoiseach convened a meeting with all party leaders to hear their views and get their input on how this thorny issue might be resolved, but it is our understanding that no further meetings have been held. Perhaps our new Taoiseach might be requested to reinstate this process, or alternatively, the Good Friday Agreement Committee might meet with him. We are pleased to inform you that the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland is currently investigating many of the cases whose families we support: Dublin Monaghan, Dundalk, Castleblaney, Miami show band and John Francis Green, as part of the Glenanne series of murders, which is known as Operation Newham. Dr. Michael Maguire expects to conclude his investigation and to report within the next 18 months. However, regarding cases where the deaths occurred in this jurisdiction, he requires access to the Barron/McEntee archive and to the relevant Garda files. We understand this will require a High Court order in the case of the archive and the invoking of the Mutual Legal Assistance Act in respect of the Garda files. And I've just had information yesterday, which is not in the presentation I've given to you, I didn't have it at the time. With regard to the mutual assistance, I understand that the PPS in Northern Ireland sent an international letter of request to our Department of Justice on the 23rd of August. And all he has received so far is an acknowledgement of receipt, but nothing else. So that is something that will need to be followed up on. Dr. Maguire has made it very clear to us that without access to these files, he will be unable to conduct a thorough investigation into the Southern cases. As Anne has said, there are at last indications that the Stormont House Agreement may soon be implemented. Unfortunately, this is not going to provide a level playing field for all victims of the conflict. The agreement envisages that two main bodies will be established: the Historical Inquiries Unit, the HIU, and the Independent Commission on Information Retrieval, the ICIR. We had a very productive meeting with the Northern Ireland Victims Commissioner, Ms Judith Thompson, on Friday last, the 6th of October. Ms Thompson confirmed that the HIU, which is a formal investigative process and which could lead to convictions in some cases, will deal with deaths that occurred within the borders of Northern Ireland only, or cases that have been passed on by the Police Ombudsman. Now, we have had one case accepted by the Police Ombudsman. This is separate from the Glenanne series, but the murder occurred in the Republic of Ireland. Dr Maguire does not anticipate being in a position to investigate this case for a number of years because of his lack of financial resources. As Anne has pointed out, the Police Ombudsman is being starved of funding. It is unclear as to what will happen to this case, as the HIU may indicate that it is outside their jurisdiction. This family has an expectation that the case will be dealt with, and it must not be allowed to fall through the cracks. The ICIR, a truth recovery process, will be the subject of an international agreement between the Irish and British governments, modelled on the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains. Families will be able to approach the ICIR and seek information on the death of their relative. The Commission would then seek answers from intermediaries. However, it is clear that the ICIR is very much the poor relation, and families whose loved ones were killed outside of Northern Ireland are being treated differently and will have access to only a second-class form of truth recovery. While the ICIR is not just intended for families outside of the North, as, for example, having received reports from the HIU, Northern families might then approach the ICIR if they have outstanding questions at that point. With regard to the HIU, it is difficult to understand why this will not also be the subject of an international agreement. It is our understanding that, ironically, some legislation will need to be passed by the Oireachtas in order to facilitate information being made available from south to north, but not from north to south. Why not? Clearly, it will be necessary to put in place a team of Gardaí to provide the information from south to north. Why can't this team also accept information from north to south? What happens to information that might be discovered in Northern Ireland relating to southern cases? In fact, it might be useful if a review were to be done on all conflict-related southern cases with a cross-border element in order to ascertain where information is missing and seek to fill in the gaps. Now, the cases that are being examined by the Police Ombudsman, as referred to above, will be completed by him. They will not be passed on to a HIU because the investigation is at an advanced stage. However, we have a number of cases that were not accepted for investigation by the Police Ombudsman. The Dublin bombings of December 1972 and January 1973, the Belturbet bombing and other single-incident cases. The families of these victims will have no option but to rely on the ICIR for possible information. Any such information provided would be difficult to verify and very much a hit-and-miss affair. We are told that your focus today is on how you, as members of this committee, may collectively be able to assist us in our endeavours on behalf of victims. In summary, we would ask you to consider A, how it may be possible to bring pressure to bear on the British so as to compel them to comply with the Dáil motions. B, to ensure that the Barham/McEntee archive and the relevant Garda files are made available to the Police Ombudsman in a prompt manner, and particularly to inquire of the Department of Justice as to what has happened regarding the international letter of request, which they acknowledged back in August. And C, to consider opening discussions with us on the role of the HIU and the ICIR, and to make representations to the Departments of Foreign Affairs and Justice in order to make the process more equal for all families. We have been informed that a consultation process on the legislation around the HIU and ICIR will begin shortly. How will families in this jurisdiction be consulted? Will it be facilitated by the Department of Foreign Affairs? We would like to express our gratitude to the committee for their assistance in having our funding restored in July 2014, following our representations to you in January of that year. We continue to be funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs Reconciliation Fund. And finally, we would also like to thank members of the cross-party group who meet with us on a regular basis to hear our concerns, and some of them are members of the Good Friday Agreement Committee, Maureen O'Sullivan, Brendan Smith and Mark Daly, and the chairperson, Kathleen Funchion, has also on occasion attended meetings, and Sean Crowe is here as well today, and Sean actually convenes the meetings for us. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Paul? Or is it Mike? Mike, okay.
Thanks very much. May we first of all thank the committee for the opportunity to provide information on the experience of our families in respect of legacy issues. The interest and assistance of state institutions in this jurisdiction have always been welcome. The promise of the Good Friday Agreement was explicitly based on the notion that nationalists would never again be left at the mercy of a one-party state, that, as much as the British government is incapable of acting with neutrality in its policy approach to the North, just so the Irish government should balance the British approach and seek to guarantee the interests of nationalists. Our clients have often felt abandoned once more in the past decade as British and Unionist campaigns to oppose truth and justice in respect of the actions of soldiers, police and their informants and agents during the conflict. If nothing else comes of this engagement, continuing interest in and monitoring of the actions of the British government in relation to legacy issues will be an important indication that the rights of victims of British and Unionist official and unofficial forces will not be ignored. Relatives for Justice was established in 1991 by relatives and supporters of people killed by British soldiers, members of the RUC, and by loyalist paramilitary organisations in circumstances where collusion with state forces is suspected. RFJ aims to provide appropriate therapeutic and developmental-based support for the bereaved and injured in the conflict within a safe environment. It also seeks to examine and develop transitional justice and truth recovery mechanisms, assisting with individual healing, contributing to positive societal change, ensuring the effective promotion and protection of human rights, social justice and reconciliation in the context of an emerging participative democracy post-conflict. RFJ was instrumental in the development of the ideas and the identification of cases to put before the European Commission and Court of Human Rights in the 1990s. The landmark ruling in 2001, known as McCarr and others versus the UK, around Article 2, the right to life, is arguably the key that has delivered an inescapable obligation on the British government to deal with the legacy of its actions and those of its agents during the conflict. While we welcome the effort to provide a measure of resolution in all deaths and injuries, it has been the actions of the British state that have received least coverage, and it is the investigations into the actions of that state that continue to be most vigorously protected by those in the police, in veterans associations, in intelligence agencies and political parties who should know better. RFJ has been supportive of the general intentions and aspirations that led to the Stormont House Agreement. In particular, the fact that this agreement had the support of all the political parties in the north of Ireland and the two governments gave it a legitimacy that earlier attempts to unravel legacy issues had not. The allocation of a decent budget of €170 million was a further indication of an apparent political will, finally, to get the job done. In our view, the architecture in the Stormont House Agreement approximates more or less to that envisaged in the earlier Eames-Bradley report and the Hass-O'Sullivan exercise. The general shape of what needs to be done is therefore unproblematic. The question will all be in the implementation. To the extent that there have been discussions on likely parameters, RFJ's monitoring has suggested general satisfaction. However, more recently, prevarication on behalf of the British authorities has been the order of the day. In particular, the British government's endless repetition of a couple of the principles mentioned in the Stormont House Agreement is both instructive and indicative of their approach. There are 6 principles intended to underpin the whole agreement. Yet, whenever James Brokenshire, and previously to him Theresa Villiers, speaks or spoke of legacy matters, they emphasise Principle 6, that legacy should be balanced, proportionate, transparent, fair and equitable. By this, they mean that there is too much focus on what the state did during the conflict. However, another principle calls for the Stormont House Agreement mechanisms to operate in a human rights compliant manner. Yet another says that the Stormont House Agreement should uphold the rule of law. But neither of these principles can operate in a way that directs equal scrutiny in terms of outcomes. In the alternative, it is a fact that the RUC and criminal justice system operated during the conflict in a manner designed to protect the state and its agents, which means that there will be added focus on their activities in investigations that are, for the first time, independent, thorough and impartial, as required by Article 2 case law. These British Government intentions underpin our suspicions about James Brokenshire's stated aim to hold a public consultation on plans for the Stormont House Agreement implementation. The agreement is now 3 years old. All parties signed up to it along with the two governments. In our view, the consultation is designed to allow for the agreed elements of the Stormont House Agreement to be undermined in legislation or by way of implementation. For the first time, the list of consultees includes British organisations and formations who have only recently become vocal as a handful of former soldiers have begun to face questioning and prosecution. This would be a bit like consulting the British Parachute Regiment veterans in advance of the establishment of the Bloody Sunday inquiry, in our view. The other indicator of British Government bad faith is its reliance on a national security veto, which they wish to enshrine in the legislation setting up the Stormont House Agreement institutions. This would allow the Secretary of State to block reports from the Historical Investigations Unit and the Independent Commission on Information Recovery on grounds of national security. The two bodies have always been envisaged as independent. Impinging on their right to publish what they see fit to publish is a serious breach of such independence. At a meeting in February 2016, Theresa Villiers assured an RFJ delegation, PFC was there as well, of course, that there was no need to worry about such matters as national security, as a veto would only be used in a handful of cases. The evidence outlined below in the next section suggests otherwise. Over the past decade, the whole state apparatus of intelligence, legacy policing, public records and information management has been busily erecting a scaffolding of policy and practice designed to prevent the leakage of the most basic information into legacy reports. Redactions now are applied over huge amounts of basic information that would in the past have been readily available in any public records. Requests for inquest records or court transcripts, both of which are, of course, held in public, from public bodies, are now routinely taking 3 years or more to access. When we do finally get them, there are often whole pages blocked out. In response to the Article 2 requirements around providing information to relatives and providing equality of arms, so that families must have more equal representation by way of solicitors and barristers, equality of arms and properly powerful fact-finding inquests, the allies of RUC Special Branch have put in place a schema of redaction that makes a mockery of any suggestion of transparency. Non-sensitive disclosure takes years. Disclosure of sensitive information is subject to enormous delay, even when such material is the subject of court orders. All these arrangements are intended to frustrate attempts to uncover the truth of what the British state was up to during the conflict. Levels of collusion have been admitted in report after report that would have been dismissed as propaganda in years gone by. Yet the PSNI, holders of public records, the NIO and the intelligence services persist in their efforts to protect their agents from prosecutions when appropriate and disclosure when required. In the absence of the Stormont House Agreement body, relatives only have the current mechanisms as a way of seeking information and closure. These are the police ombudsman and legacy inquests. Both of these have been progressively starved of resources, as Anne has already outlined to some in respect of the police ombudsman. The former now has faced year-on-year budget reductions. The latter, the inquest, having an agreed £45 million budget blocked by Arlene Foster when devolution was in operation, and now by James Brokensshire in the face of the Lord Chief Justice's urgent requests. Both mechanisms had been accepted by the Council of Europe as meeting the required criteria of independence and thoroughness to be Article 2 compliant. The shredding of resources is simply the most recent means of undermining European case law and judgments. Coming to a conclusion, the outcome of all these problems is becoming increasingly evident. Judicial frustration is emerging in case after case. Anne's already mentioned the one in relation to Glenanne. In civil cases such as Flynn and Monaghan, where police handlers have been shown to subvert the law and protect agents who have committed murder and attempted murder, the PSNI prevaricates and delays in carrying out court orders on disclosure. In cases of massive collusion, Bernard, the Glenanne case, the PSNI has been shamed by the judiciary for refusing to allow independent thematic reports. In cases that the state is breaching Article 2 and failing to provide proper investigations, such as Hughes, the Loughgall case, and a couple of other cases I mentioned there, the judges are ruling in favour of the applicants. In our view, the judiciary are sending the message that the rule of law is being undermined by the approach of the PSNI and Crown lawyers to disclosure in legacy and in wider legacy matters. But the approach by the police and intelligence agencies is also undermining the new policing dispensation. Every time the police refuse to hand over material, our families and the public more generally suspect that they have something to hide. That something was under the old dispensation of the RUC. But if the new police service continues to hide material, they gather up the reputation of the old discredited institutions and place it on their backs. The Chief Constable, George Hamilton, claims he wishes to hand over legacy matters and concentrate on policing the present. He, however, and his deputy, Drew Harris, were RUC officers. By their actions, they are protecting the legacy of the RUC and thereby undermining both the reputation and the potential legacy of the PSNI. A final outcome of this satisfactory situation is that legacy controversies re-traumatise families who are seeking justice and truth. Powerful forces and institutions have implemented the same strategic approach of embargoing access to the truth in response to domestic judicial court rulings and orders much in the same way. In our view, they have with international in the same way, in our view that they have with international scrutiny. Overall, the approach equates to a continuing form of impunity for its agents and their actions during the conflict. Anne's already mentioned the visit by Niels Muiznieks, the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe, when he visited Belfast in November 2014, and he described it as a continuing form of impunity. This impacts significantly on those bereaved and injured, adding additional psychological harms to their trauma. The result is, at best, daily anxiety, stress, poor mental health and actual physical illness. Indeed, many of the bereaved have died prematurely of illnesses and poor health that their families attribute directly to the de facto impunity and denial of a proper investigative process that holds to account those responsible for egregious violations. It's now 16 years since the initial European Court ruling that gives effect to the current obligation under European human rights law to investigate state-caused deaths. The refusal by the UK to provide victims with a remedy by way of implementing Article 2 compliant investigations is now systemic. It is for these reasons that RFJ appeals to the committee to consider urgent appeals to the British Government, the NIO and the Chief Constable of the PSNI to expedite the implementation of the Stormont House Agreement and cooperation with existing legacy mechanisms in disclosure and other matters. Otherwise, the UK will continue this perpetual cycle of delaying and denying the bereaved and injured their rights, thus exacerbating the additional transgenerational harms already referred to. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mike. Paul, did you want to? Oh, you'll come in on the questions. Okay, so I'm going to open it up then to the floor for questions. So, anybody? Senator Daly. And then what we'll do is we'll take a few questions together and then we'll come back to yourselves. And if people could indicate if they have a question for a specific person or is it just a general one.
Yeah, thanks, Chair, and thanks for your presentation and for your ongoing work to get truth behind what happened in the conflict. And thanks especially to Anne Cadwallader for her assistance in the report for the committee that we launched in August. Having met the Victims Commissioner and outlining the amount of cases, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there is it 1,300 outstanding cases that have yet to be investigated, 300 of which involve former members of the security forces, of which 7 or 8 are actively under investigation. Or I might be incorrect in that. You might outline that for the members. It's an enormous amount of files, and as has been outlined, the resources aren't being put in there, and the actual the people who are supposed to be doing the investigation have a vested interest in making sure it doesn't happen with all the with all the requirements that have been put upon them, they seem to be able to frustrate that. And it now appears that, you know, with Brexit and the wish that they're going to leave the jurisdiction of European courts, I know the European Court of Justice is a different issue, but like that's not to say they won't leave that jurisdiction as well, which they have spoken about previously in different party manifestos. We've all seen the motions, we've all supported the motion in the Dáil and elsewhere. The fact that the European courts have ruled so long ago, and in practical terms, and this then goes back to, you know, when you have a leverage, you have to use it in relation to the Brexit negotiations, and Ireland has to be solved, and the Good Friday Agreement, of course, is part of that, we need to put pressure upon the British government and say, well, like, if you're leaving the European Union, part of that is you must live up to the rulings of European courts, although they're not part of the European Union per se. And that might be some angle that we might pursue, Margaret, at another meeting, in terms of, you know, that they are waiting for all the people involved to die. They're waiting for them to die, and the victims and their families are being further victimised by the actual treatment they're receiving at the hands of the British government and the security forces. So it might be another option, because they are impervious to Dáil motions. The British ambassador doesn't do anything in relation to releasing the files, and you know, while he talks about assisting, they simply do not assist. And, you know, we all know there was collusion, we all know it was a state-sponsored policy, we all know that it was known at the highest level all the way to the Prime Minister's office. So here we have an alleged democratic country involved in crimes that would have been seen in South and Central America, murder gangs being instructed by their handlers, and I think in Anne Cadwallader's submission to the committee, at some stage there was only 2 people in the UVF who weren't paid informers in the Shankill Road. You know, so this was a state structure, and they are impervious to all sorts of things. The only thing that they are concerned about at this stage, the only leverage we have, is Brexit, and making the case that as they're leaving the door, as they're going out the door, part of the agreement is that they have to fulfil obligations under the Good Friday Agreement, and that those issues would have to be resolved as part of the settlement. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Paul Maskey.
Thank you. Obviously, I'd like to thank them all for coming in today, and obviously I've heard and met with a number of you, but obviously before, so I know some of the issues and many of the issues obviously that you're dealing with. And I suppose from my point of view, obviously just to commend you on the work that you do and what you have been involved in over the years, and continue to wish you every success in the future. With regards to I suppose, any dealings yourselves have had with, like, say, NIO or British government, regarding where it's fails or whatever it is, to come forward, which is being asked for, what has been the response from them? Obviously, has it been any way fruitful at all? Are they given any times or any thoughts of some of that information coming forward to be brought to be handed over? And I suppose some of that stuff obviously goes on to the Stormont House Agreement. There's no reason why it shouldn't be, in my view. There's no reason why it shouldn't be up and running. It's simple, and it's down, and I suppose what you have is the DUP and the British government blaming each other. Because the DUP will say, well, that's over the British government, they can release the money, and the British government will say, well, it's not cross-party because the DUP aren't agreeing it. So, in my view, that's a wrong view, and obviously, I suppose, if we are working our way through and doing a report on this particular matter, and then I think hopefully that will put pressure to bear on those who are maybe reneging on making sure that justice is coming forward, because as Mark has made the point, and I mean, I meet many victims in my own constituency as well, family members are dying. And it's a very big issue that they have. Some of these families have fought, in some cases, over 40-odd years to try and get justice for their loved ones. And it's really difficult and really hard for them to do it. But, I mean, what families will tell you themselves, with their grandchildren are now looking at this now, and they're taking that forward. So we need to get the issue of legacy resolved. And I suppose just to commend yourselves again on the work, because you will get it resolved, and I have no doubt about that, with the work and the commitment that you have put into this up to now, and will continue to do so. So it's just a views on if there has been any correspondence or any dealings with the NIO and the British government, what has the response been?
Deputy Brannock.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the Pat Finucane Centre, the Justice for the Forgotten and Relatives for Justice for giving such an excellent presentation, and indeed the people in the gallery who obviously have come to hear what we have to say, and you, Chair, have asked that we'd ask questions, but I think it's important, coming from the border constituency where many people have either been victims or indeed combatants, and I've described all of them as victims, whether they're the silent majority or not. I think it was the grace of God that I wasn't a victim of the Dundalk bombing myself, only for the fact that I got a lift home. My own father's office was wrecked beside it where he would normally wait for me to come to, and he had just left the office when the explosion happened. And I think it's important to remember people like Jack Rooney and Hugh Waters, not to mention Tom Oliver, Jean McConville and Seamus Ludlow. Indeed, in my own, within 100 yards of my own bedroom, the body of Gerard Evans was found, and indeed, looking out the bedroom window of my parents' house that I lived in, Eugene Simmons was probably one of the first victims of the now so-called disappeared. He certainly wasn't described as that at the time. He was one of the first to be found, I think back in 1981. And that, I suppose, leaves us with, whether it's those people or any of the other victims that you're dealing with, the importance to find the Fianna, Carta and Adini. But I have to say it was taken with the Irish word for reconciliation, which goes along with all of this issue of legacy. And I'm delighted that today we're getting down to some of the nitty-gritty, because I suppose we've been preoccupied with Brexit since I came in virtually to this House, and I think it's more of this we need, and more interaction with all sides to try and at least move forward the pain of the victims. But the word for reconciliation is winterous, and the word winter is so important. That's communities sitting down and not hating anything anymore. I think there's been too much hidden and swept under the carpet on all sides, and our obligation, as I see it, as members of the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, is we're obligated to find that truth, justice and closure for families, and it'll probably never happen. But to finish with the question, I'm just interested, as somebody who obviously was never invited to any of the outreach, and I know I'm only a relatively new deputy but spent 25 years on local authority, I'm interested from the three groupings to know the degree of percentage of representation from both sides, because I think it's important. You've said you're representing all sides, but I'd be interested to see or to hear from you the type of numbers that are coming from both sides of the conflict, because I have engaged, I suppose, with many on all sides, and you hear different stories, and it's very difficult to put together. And the reason I ask that is that, when you, Francis has just gone out, but we recently were with the Bridge of Hope in Belfast, and the stories of the legacies, not just the deaths and murders, but the issues that are still ongoing, need to be debated. People need to come in here and find a voice that maybe a lot of the public out there are not hearing. But by these public sessions, the people begin to realise that we're prepared to talk, and we're prepared to try and reach that reconciliation. But I'm interested to know the number of people in each of the three groupings. Are they coming from all sides, or what are the percentages? Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy. We'll come back to yourselves now, so if you just want to, whoever wants to kind of start, maybe Anne, and then go down the line.
Okay, I'll just answer a few of those questions. Thank you for referring to the submission I made to your work on going forward towards a united Ireland, the problems and everything. One of the reasons I sent you a lot of documents, but if anybody's interested in seeing the documentary evidence upon which we base some of the you might consider wild allegations about collusion. Well, if you are interested in seeing the documentary evidence dating back to 1972, 1973, about guns being taken, no evidence of any investigation, all that, the joint membership of the UDA and the UDR, then Mark has those documents. I presume they're available in the library at some
Fine. Well, they're in the big version of the report.
There you are. Good. So it's very important from the PFC's point of view that when we make allegations and statements, we do so on the basis of evidence. We're not interested in what the dogs in the street say or do. We are interested in hard evidence, and our families are also similarly interested in hard evidence. When Mark talked about the number of cases that remain to be investigated, that's problematic. If I could illustrate that, there is one case, for example, that the HET did investigate, a triple murder, that the HET discovered that the RUC closed down the investigation into those 3 murders after 2 weeks. They just did virtually nothing. Now, that case is, in some definitions, closed, because the HET has investigated it. But obviously, those 3 families are totally frustrated, because they've been told that there was no police investigation into their case. The HET has confirmed it, so they want to ask why. So that is a case which on one level could be said to be closed, but as far as the families are concerned, certainly not closed. On the British trying to escape their obligations under the European Convention, even if they walked away from the European Convention tomorrow, they would still have to answer questions and be responsible for their actions during the time that they were signatories to the Convention. So they can't escape their obligations there. On the intergenerational trauma and how children and children of children are being traumatised and are throwing themselves into investigating cases. There's one example I can give you of the great-grandchild of a hooded man, of one of the hooded men, who is now involved in investigating his great-grandfather's case. So this is not a question of letting people die. The trauma will continue and survive down the decades if it's not resolved. Dare I even suggest that in this state, your trauma from the Civil War remains unresolved. And we're coming to some anniversaries of that, and I think that will be evident in the discussions that will go on at that time. In Spain, after the Civil War in Spain, they had an agreement to forget. And people sometimes said to us in the North, why can't you be like the Spanish, have an agreement to forget? Well, I don't think they're saying that quite so much at the moment. And finally, we're very worried that the HET, imperfect as it was, did some good work, especially in the Glenanne series, and there are others as well. They weren't perfect. They did some really terrible investigations, but they did do some good ones. And I think the British government is absolutely terrified of this being repeated. They are terrified about what they did during the conflict being exposed. They're terrified, but there's a massive possible benefit for the community in the North. If people in the North understood much better what went on during the conflict and how they were manipulated and how cynical forces that they knew nothing of at the time were involved, then the potential for reconciliation is much greater. I try to answer. As far as the Pat Finucane Centre is concerned, we do represent people from both communities. We wouldn't pretend for that to be equal. The community in the North is so divided that people will only go and ask for help from organisations that they believe they can trust. And we do have families from the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community that we advocate on behalf of. Most of them want to be, if they come to us for help, don't want anyone to hear about it. So we totally respect that confidential request, and so I can't tell you about it. But take it from me, there are people, not as many as the Catholic nationalist community, but we do have people that we quietly in the background do a lot of work that we can't talk about, and that would include that line of inquiry, that line of investigation.
Thanks, Anne. Do you and the rest want to come in on those questions?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. A couple of you mentioned the failure of the British to release the files as demanded by the Dáil motions, 3 Dáil motions now. And Mark, I think, said that the British ambassador is doing nothing about it, and obviously you've had meetings with him, and that's why I suggested that. I know the former Taoiseach Enda Kenny had brought all the party leaders together last October to discuss how to get your input as leaders of the opposition, to get your input as to how this might be resolved or progressed, but the meetings didn't continue. So that's one of the things I'm hoping that may come out of this, that you might ask the new Taoiseach to reinstate those meetings, or to perhaps the Good Friday Agreement will come up with some ideas, because it just seems that the British just feel so comfortable in totally ignoring, and I think Brendan Smith has said in the Dáil that they have felt comfortable in ignoring the requests of a sovereign parliament. And that, I think also, Paul, you were asking about that, and there was also the idea of, as Mark said, that they're waiting for the families to die. Well, many of our families have died, and as Anne has said, the next generation has taken up the gauntlet and is continuing with it. But it's just, delay. So it's just, it's so frustrating for all families. Declan mentioned the Dundalk bombing, and indeed we represent those families, and also one of the survivors who was very badly injured. And you also talked about reconciliation and how important it is. Well, in our view, reconciliation is unlikely to be achieved without the truth. I think before you can have reconciliation, you have to have truth. You asked about Declan asked about the degree of representation. Well, obviously we operate here in the Republic, so all of our people would come from one side of the community. We have represented a family from the other side of the community in the past. We assisted them in their dealings with the HET, because their family member, they live down here, but their family member was killed in Derry, in fact. So we have experience of helping the Protestant community as well in that case. Okay.
Thanks, Margaret. Paul?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I think probably the present situation is a reflection about the North hasn't been a priority for, I have to say, for both governments, but primarily for the Tory government, and Brexit and the difficulties of that at the minute. And the collapse of Stormont has seen that there hasn't been a focus on dealing with the past, and hence where we're now at the minute, where none of the mechanisms, which will certainly, I think all of us are agreed, given even with the cross-border stuff, would have given some measure of resolution and tried to deal with the past. So in that situation, I think it's maybe important for the likes of this committee to try and emphasise the Irish government, and I know you have done good work. I mean, from the days when in this committee the Good Friday Agreement was set up, when you had both the Irish and British governments, constantly the North was their focus of attention. I think we need to get back to those days, and that's what's happened. At present, just to give you some sense, relative to justice, we were set up, our origins was about state violence, but that doesn't mean we don't represent. We represent people, for example, who the IRA killed their loved ones, and I think it's probably reflected. And we also have what we call a quilt project, where we loved ones put a square on a quilt. There's maybe made up about 40 squares on it. And we're up to quilt 11, and most of them obviously are people who were killed by loyalists, by the RUC, UDR and the British Army, but there's also people on it who were killed by the IRA. So while obviously it's mostly people who are on the receiving end of state violence, we also represent. But I think I was just looking at trying to give you a sense of where things are at the minute, and both Margaret and Anne and Meg had mentioned, the only mechanism people have at the minute in the North is the police ombudsman. and it's been starved of resources, despite the fact that there was a judicial review recently in the High Court in Belfast, where the judge was scathing and saying more resources should go to it. But if you look at present, they have 400 complaints in, and the Ombudsman is primarily dealing with complaints against the former police service in the north, the RUC. So they're dealing with 400 complaints. Some of them, I've just outlined 8 or 9, they give them all these names: Operation Achilles, Operation Greenwich. And most of these investigations are around the RUC misconduct, RUC handlers with running agents in both the UDA and the UVF. The whole issue, a big key thing in all these, I'll just give you, is about preventability. Could the murders have been prevented? Could the agents, and we had one yesterday, for example, in the High Court, Gary Hegarty, who was involved in 5 or 6 murders of Catholics, who made strong claims about 2 handlers who he'd give that information to, yet these 5 Catholics were murdered. So you have Operation Achilles, which deals with killings in South Belfast in a bookmaker's shop by the UDA, and 3 other murders in South Belfast. And that's primarily the Ombudsman looking at collusion between the UDA and the RUC. You've got Operation Greenwich, which involves 20 murders of most of them who were people who were members of Sinn Féin or were members of the IRA, who were killed by the UDA in acting on information from the RUC, and members of the UDR involved in it. And that's imminent to be published. You have the Loughlin Island report, maybe some of you know about, was published, was focused on the UVF and the issue of South African weapons being used there, which was a shipment of weapons. You have Operation Ashton, which is another 19 murders in East Tyrone, some of them Republicans and Nationalists killed by the UVF. You have Operation Newham, which is Glenanne, and that's many murders, is that? That's 120. You have another major operation announced by the Ombudsman, which is called Operation Medfield, which is looking at the UDA and UVF in the Greater Belfast area from the 1970s right up until the end of the conflict. And again, it's about RUC misconduct, RUC special branch handling agents, killing both Republicans and Catholics. And then there's a major investigation by the Ombudsman into the South African weapons shipment, which the British intelligence knew about, which both the DUP and Ulster Resistance were involved in and bringing into the north. And now there's obviously other ones. I think there's an investigation around steak knife, which is this allegations of this informer was in the IRA. But that gives you some sense of the state collusion between RUC, British intelligence, and that's what maybe Michael touched on. It is what we're dealing with primarily. Yes, everybody's entitled to and the people the IRA killed, those relatives are entitled to the truth and to know what happened to their loved ones. But there's a higher threshold on the state. This is the state acting with impunity. British soldiers, RUC men and UDR members.
Just a quick clarification. When you said the South African weapons, it was Ulster Resistance, not the DUP. There are some allegations of that there were links between the Ulster Resistance and the DUP. Just to clarify that. Right. Just to clarify that. I just wanted to address the point that you were bring up, Paul, about what's been the reaction of the NIO to requests for information. I think they always say we want to make this happen. And I think there are elements within the British state who do want to get things done, because every 6 months, they're in front of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, and they have to take hard questions from their European colleagues on why they're not getting this done. So there's a kind of a policy decision to actually do it, and they've signed up to it. But it's just they come under, various pressures. Most recently from these veterans who are now up in arms because finally some soldiers are ending up in the dock. So then they have to manage that at a political level. But I think the question of national security, intelligence, is a difficult one for them. And the best story, perhaps, is when the Pat Finucane's family went over to Downing Street to meet David Cameron, when they thought he was going to agree to provide, finally, for a public inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane. At that meeting, and it's on public record, everybody, it's been said by the family, that David Cameron indicated that there are people around here, and he was pointing around Westminster generally, who won't allow a public inquiry in that case. So the politicians aren't the arbiters of these kinds of national security issues. And I think that's the difficulty for those of them who want to actually get something done, that the British state is becoming very, very determined to try and nail down the national security. In the past, national security has been a kind of a movable feast. It's whenever they want to invoke it, whereas now they're trying to put it into legislation, and it's quite a difficult job to put something like that into legislation, and it means that they're getting themselves completely consumed by the whole matter. Obviously, there are people who are much more malignly intentioned, shall we say. But when you look at the De Silva report that eventually came out of what David Cameron acceded to the Finucane family, I read the De Silva report. It's not enough. But when you read it, you say, my goodness, what are they wanting to hide? Because some of the information that's in that report is just completely devastating and damning, the level of collusion that there was. So you kind of say, well, if that's what they're willing to put into the public domain, what exactly is it that they've got to hide? And I think that's the thing that we're all wrestling with. And yet, you know, the tenacity of families has meant that we know so much more now than we did in the past. And I think it's a question of keeping on digging, and eventually we'll get more and more information. But of course, the British state is one of the most secretive in the world. It brought forward the Official Secrets Act in 1911 as a temporary measure, you know, and it's still in place now, and arguably has been built on. So it's a hard job, but we keep digging away. And I think the important thing is that international law backs us up. Anytime international experts come and visit the North, they confirm what we're asking for in terms of transparency, and they're saying that the onus is on the British state to show why they shouldn't hand over the relevant documentation. So it's something that we just have to keep fighting on. Just in terms of numbers of cases, I think you're quite accurate, Mr. Daly, in relation to the numbers. Those are the kind of ballpark figures that people talk about. But I think what Anne says is very important, that many people who got a HET report, technically it may be closed, but many of them were unsatisfied with it, and they're asking more questions. And I think we have to say that if there are questions that remain unanswered, particularly if there's new information that has come forward, then that has to go onto the caseload. But it's in those kind of ballpark figures that we're talking about. The final question, Mr. Brach, in terms of numbers on both sides, Paul's already said, but we also do, I should say that not many, but there are people from the Protestant community who come and avail of our therapeutic services as well, which is important to say. But as Anne says, these are sensitive issues and they can't be publicised too much, you know, like in terms of... But we're absolutely clear, whoever walks through that door, and there have been people from the Loyalist community who sought for help in relation to the activities of the state forces against their people. Anybody who comes through our door, we're willing to help, and we guarantee them the same level of service and assistance.
Thanks, Mike. There's 3 more questions, or 3 more people indicating, and then I just have 1 or 2 questions myself. So, Deputy Smith first.
Thank you very much, Cahill. Can I join with the other members of the committee in welcoming our guests and to thank them for their presentations. I've been very familiar over the years with the work of Margaret and Justice for the Forgotten, and also with Anne's work in more recent years. And I have to say, Anne's book, Lethal Allies, British Collusion in Ireland, that brought together a huge amount of information about the horrors that were inflicted in collusion with the British state security forces, and the amount of people who were murdered by those gangs. And immediately after the publication of Anne's book, I secured a Dáil debate on that issue at the time, where I then Taoiseach Minister for Foreign Affairs, Eamon Gilmore, responded at that time and stated that he would bring all those issues to the attention of the British government. But I think it's a work and it's a book that's a very good reference in regard to the horrors that were inflicted on so many innocent people, aided and abetted by the British state security forces. Also, Margaret's Justice for the Forgotten group from your formation in the mid-1990s, I've been familiar with your work, and I'm very glad, along with Mark and Maureen O'Sullivan and Sean Crowe, that we meet, and along with some of the visitors here today as well, that we have the opportunity to meet practically every month in trying to progress the search for justice and the search for information. And the last day that there were oral questions to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, I had down a question to the Minister in relation to the non-response by the British government to the 3 motions passed unanimously by Dáil Éireann, calling for the British government to give access to an independent international legal person to those files, papers pertaining to those murders and those bombings. And I think some of the phraseology that I used that day that was absolutely reprehensible, it was deplorable, and was totally unacceptable that the British government have ignored the unanimous requests of a sovereign parliament. And it's absolutely reprehensible. And we've all had discussions with successive British ambassadors, with successive secretaries of state as well. And unfortunately, the answer has been evasive and a non-answer to all of us. I think my colleague Declan Brannock would have been in Cardiff when I had a very vigorous exchange with the present Secretary of State in regard to the obfuscation and the non-answers he continues to give as well. And Declan and myself will be at the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly meeting on Sunday and Monday. If we have the opportunity, we'll be raising it again. And I think it might be no harm if we as a committee wrote a letter to Mr Brokenshire stating that this matter was considered again today at our committee, and it's the unanimous request of this committee that the British government should respond to the requests of our national parliament. I think we have to keep it on the agenda, and Margaret would be aware that Deputies Maureen O'Sullivan, Sean Crowe and myself met with the former Minister for Foreign Affairs, Deputy Charlie Flanagan, on this issue some time before the government changed, or the membership of the government changed. And I have a request with Simon Coveney to meet us again on behalf of the cross-party group, the 3 of us, to meet again. And it's absolutely scandalous that we've made no progress on this issue. All the Dáil request was a very responsible, comprehensive motion, just asking for access to the papers and files to an independent person, an international independent person, and it's deplorable that it hasn't been responded to, and we just have to keep it on the agenda. And as every day goes by, it goes without saying that everybody's getting older, and families then are seeing the possibility of getting justice. It decreases every day, unfortunately, so it does. I could also ask, just with regard to the police ombuds in Northern Ireland and their refusal to include the Belturbet bombing of December 1972, would there be any point, do you think, Margaret, in us as a committee asking for those particular bombings and murders and tragedies, us asking if they would include them at this particular stage? Maybe you give it some consideration, come back to us. We could, as a committee, I'm sure, with the agreement of the committee, ask if it's the appropriate route to go. But I just want to, whatever requests you make of us as a committee here, we'd be glad to support you in your work. The work is extremely important, and I just commend the 3 organisations for the ongoing advocacy and representative work you do on behalf of victims and families, and unfortunately in memory of so many people who are gone needlessly, whose lives were taken, innocent people as well. Thank you, Cathaoirligh.
Thanks, Deputy Smith. Senator Black.
Chair, and thank you all so much for coming in today. Fantastic presentation that you've given us. And I mean, it's a huge injustice what's going on, and I can only imagine what it's like for families, you know, who are really traumatised by the issue of what they've gone through is awful. And I think you're so right what you say, Margaret. I mean, reconciliation, there's definitely, there has to be truth before reconciliation, and then hopefully trust, you know, and the trust is completely gone, and that's what kind of is born out of injustice and what has happened. I know myself, I totally agree with Deputy Smith on what he said. I would like to see us really make this a priority from the committee's point of view. I think it's really, really important. I worked, you know, as I was listening to you talk, I worked cross-community, cross-border with a group one time. It was really around trauma, but a little bit different. But what I found really interesting was the people who came up from the south, you know, and they were dealing with their own traumatic issues. And they were listening to people who, from the Unionist side and the Republican side, who had been really, really traumatised from a point of view of living in the conflict, family members dying, huge injustices going on. And what really what it really kind of jumped out at me was that the people from the south had absolutely no idea as to what the people in the north were going through. And I think, and particularly around what you're talking about today, the injustices that have hit an awful lot of families. And I think in a way that little model is the same as what's going on now down here as well. Like, nobody really understands what it was like, you know, and what that devastation, what the feeling down here in particular. And what Deputy Smith said is so spot on. We have to keep our foot on the pedal on this. We have to prioritise this. I mean, you've answered my question, particularly, Margaret, when you spoke about, you know, what you would like us to do as a committee. But I wasn't aware of the monthly meetings, and I'd love to be involved in those monthly, definitely, and I know that my colleague here said the same as well. We'd love to be involved, and we would love to be, you know, really pushing forward, and I'm sure the Chair would agree with me on this. We really want to push forward on this and do our utmost, you know, to try and get the truth for the families, because you're right, you're so right, trauma is carried on down through generations, and it lasts for many, many, many generations. And the impact, it's insidious, it's soul destroying, and it's devastating. And we have to get to the bottom of this, and we have to do our utmost and work extremely hard. I suppose if there was, the only question I would have is, from your perspective, what would be the first thing you want us to work on? What's the top priority for you? And how you see us doing that going forward. And I agree with Deputy Smith. I do think we need to write a letter from this committee. So anyway, I suppose that's really all I want to say. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Nicky Brady.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentations. And you had mentioned about state weapons being used in murder. I'd just like to mention a case that I had some personal knowledge of. A colleague, I worked in Belfast in the 70s when the Shankill Butchers were pursuing their reign of terror, and a colleague of mine, Ted McQuaid, was murdered in the Cliftonville Road in the mid-70s. Now, when he was shot, a guy got out of a black taxi, I think it was Lenny Murphy, and shot him. He was shot with a weapon that had been taken off a UDR man in the drinking club in the Shankill by two days before, or that particular night maybe. And when he was shot, while he was still dying on the ground, the British Army were there. One of them actually said, as far as I know from colleagues there, said the act of contrition into his ear. So they were on the scene. The taxi was driving away. It was pointed out to them. They did nothing. But reading the HET report, the RUC knew within 2 days who had taken that weapon off this UDR man. Taken being maybe a euphemism, is probably possibly given them. But they did nothing about that. And if you consider the case of Shankill Butchers, they weren't using cars that were burnt out. They were using a black taxi. You know, so that was the vehicle that was used all the time. So that's just one indication. That's a case that hasn't really been mentioned over the years. And I have Ted's brother lives in Uri now, and I've spoken to him quite a lot over the years. And there's another family that has never had justice. He was 25, newly married, just bought a new house in Suffolk, and his life was taken from him. The other thing, in terms of people dying, I would have a lot of contact with the O'Hare family. Majella O'Hare was again murdered by the British Army. She was shot with a heavy-duty machine gun. She was 12 years of age. And if you read that HET, the paratrooper, I think it's Michael Williams, they called him, was taken to court and acquitted. But that family has never had justice, because she was shot going to church confession. Her father was in the graveyard cutting grass when it happened. He was on the scene. But if you read the report, there's 10 British soldiers present at a checkpoint. The Marines were coming in to take over from the Paras. He shot Majella O'Hare. 8 of the soldiers, he claimed he saw a gunman, allegedly, and this is why he fired. 8 of the soldiers said they agreed with him. The 2 that were closest to him disagreed with him. That was never taken into account. So those are just examples. And the other question I would ask Anne particularly, or Margaret, sorry, in terms of the Dublin Monaghan bombings, do you think that on both sides of the border, in terms of the British government and indeed the government here in the 26 counties, there's a lot more information that was known and could be released, which would expedite any investigation and resolution of that horrible atrocity?
Thanks. Okay, I just have 2 brief questions as well for yourselves before I'll let you back in. Anne, just you made a point in your remarks about the criminal justice budget. I think it's 0.2% goes to legacy issues. In the additional £1 billion, £1 billion, I should say, that has been secured, do you know if any of this has been allocated for legacy? And Margaret, in relation to the cases that are not accepted by the Ombudsman, was there any reason given, or what were the reasons given? So if you want to come in, just not only in relation to those, but in relation to the other questions, or any kind of concluding remarks that you want to make.
Well, very briefly, Kathleen, it's the Police Ombudsman's budget, 0.2% of the Police Ombudsman's, of the overall criminal justice budget goes to the Ombudsman, and of that, only 22% of that, or 23% of that goes to legacy. So if I drew a line on the map, the line would be wider than the actual section on the diagram. It's minute, absolutely minute, and as far as we're aware, none of the DUP's money is going to that, no. In relation to weapons, we've got a document dating back to 1973 that says that most weapons in the hands of loyalists originated from the UDR. All modern weapons, all loyalist modern weapons, that's all submachine guns, automatic weapons like that, originated from the UDR. So all the murders that were carried out by loyalists at that time using submachine guns, those weapons originated from the UDR. Between 5 and 15% of all members of the UDR, the British Army's own internal assessment was that between 5 and 15% of all members of the UDR, that's the largest regiment in the British Army at the time, were also in the UDA and the UVF. The British kept very accurate accounts of every month of all the weapons that went missing month by month by month, routinely, that were being taken and where collusion was suspected. Hardly any month went by when weapons did not go missing. And there was never any investigation into the weapons going missing. And just one example is one weapon that was taken from Glenann UDR base in South Armagh was used to kill 11 people over a period of 11 months. 19 children lost their fathers as a result, and 5 children were orphaned by that weapon. There was no investigation. The platoon wasn't stood down. There wasn't an internal inquiry about how this weapon went missing. And the same could be said of all the hundreds of weapons that went missing in inverted commas from the UDR. They simply didn't care. And collusion was referred to right from 1972 onwards. They knew those weapons weren't being taken to be hidden or used for any other purpose other than sectarian murder.
Okay. Brendan asked, and indeed Kathleen asked, about the cases not accepted by the police ombudsman, and in particular Dublin December 72, Dublin January 73 and Belturbet. Now, the point about it is that the police ombudsman, his remit is quite limited in a way, because he can only examine or investigate misfeasance by the police. He cannot really examine if it's British Army, if it's UDR. He can't really investigate that, unfortunately. But that is the only mechanism, as Mike has said, that we currently have. And he's way down the road now in investigating Glenanne. So I put in complaints in relation to Dublin 72 and Belturbet. I did not even put in a complaint in relation to Dublin January 73 because there is so little information about that bombing. So there was no way I could even formulate, well, I did formulate the complaint, but there was really no point when the other ones were rejected. Now, I appealed the December 72 decision, but again, that appeal was rejected. With the case of Belturbet, there is a possibility, a very slight possibility, that there's a possibility to be accepted. It has been rejected, but something has happened recently that they believe it may be linked to another particular case that they are examining at the moment. So it's just possible that that will be accepted, and I should know that next week. There will be a decision taken on it. With regard to you asking the police ombudsman, I'm not sure that would be appropriate, because obviously the police ombudsman makes the decision based on the evidence in front of him, and if we haven't got, I won't say evidence, I shouldn't say evidence, I should say information. If we don't really have information as to police misfeasance, I don't suppose he's going to take it up. I don't know, maybe we could discuss it further, or the committee could discuss whether they think that would be an appropriate thing to do. I think somebody mentioned yes, the Shankill butchers. In fact, I think I actually deal a bit with the Shankill butchers in my book, A State in Denial. And, you know, Jimmy Nesbitt, Inspector Jimmy Nesbitt, is lauded for having solved the case of the Shankill butchers. But I think if Gerard Lavery, who is now deceased, I think, if he hadn't survived, that would never have been solved. And I think you're quite right that it really was allowed to go on when they knew very well who was responsible. Francis, I think I'm delighted to hear that you would like to be, and Declan would like to join the cross-party group, and I can tell you there's a meeting next Wednesday at 1 o'clock, and it will be here. Did I answer everything, or was there some other question that I've missed out on? I'm not sure.
I think you've covered everything.
Sorry.
One specific thing to work on that you would like us to really, as a committee, what would that be, or what would be your priority?
Well, I've given you an A, B and C, I think, so I've given you
but
three.
If there's a priority in all of those going forward and you want us to work on one big one, or is it just, do you want it to kind of...
I think
they're all important.
From our point, I think we have a suspicion, and it may not be fair, that when the Irish government or ministers meet their counterparts, their British counterparts, that it's very much a tick box exercise. Maybe it's unfair. Maybe I'm not being reasonable. But we're not, obviously not in the room when the meetings happen. For all we know, the Minister for Foreign Affairs bangs the table and makes demands, and is tough and negotiates well. We don't know because we're not there. But we do sometimes fear that when ministers from Ireland, the Irish government, meet British ministers, there isn't quite the sense of outrage and passion that we have, that other economic and other issues take precedence, and the rights of people in Northern Ireland that have been so trampled on are not something that is that really gets the blood up, you know? Whether that's expressed through hard negotiations or banging the table. But we sometimes fear that it is just a question of, oh, by the way, last item on the agenda, what are you going to do about the Dublin Monaghan bombings? Oh, you're not going to do anything. Fine, fine, okay, let's see each other again next month. That might be very unfair.
Sorry, there was just one other thing. I knew I'd missed out something. Francis referred to the fact of people here not really knowing anything about what went on in the north and so on. And indeed, when we were here before the committee nearly 4 years ago, I spoke about the amnesia that there are victims of the conflict in this jurisdiction. I spoke about the amnesia of governments. I spoke about the amnesia of the media in particular. And the southern media does not report much of what has happened in relation to cases in the north or collusion, or it's just totally swept under the carpet. It's just not dealt with at all. And I think that is part of the problem. And of course, for so many years, we had Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act, and I think that, you know, had a very detrimental effect on this state. So, but I think that the media still continue to ignore the conflict in general.
Paul?
Just 2 points. One, just to clarify with the police ombudsman. I mean, their budget. I mean, the police ombudsman has remit primarily for current policing in the north, so that's the PSNI, and if they're involved in controversial killings or ill treatment, stuff like that. So they have a smaller part of their budget, if you like, deals with historic division, and I think maybe there's something in the region of 20 investigators, 25 investigators trying to deal with 400 complaints, murders. So that'll give you some sense where, and just it was something that Mickey Brady had brought up about the Shankill Butchers. We actually have a RFJ represents some of the families who are not mentioned, but we have a written complaint in with. I don't know how many people know the Shankill Butchers were a UVF loyalist gang. They operated in the mid-1970s in primarily in North Belfast, and they were involved in 30 murders. Not all of them, most of them just Catholics, and several people who were members of the UDA or UVF who they killed, and some people who they thought were Catholics but turned out Protestants, and they operated within a, believe it or not, in a 2 or 3 mile radius. That's for all the people who were killed, and most of their victims were killed with knives and butcher cleavers, and they dragged them into as Mickey Brady says, in the back of a black taxi, which one of them owned, and then they had another car, and they kept the knives in their own houses. So, that begs the question, obviously, where did the police not? Because this happened over a 4 or 5 year period. But anyway, we have that. But that's kind of gives you a frustration of families that it's in that 400 and hasn't even been started yet. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
And just in respect of that, I mean, it's if the family that you know want to talk to us about what information, because we've gathered a fair amount of information about that, we'd be very happy to share that. There's one other thing that I just wanted to mention, which occurs to me, in a couple of cases, just to share with you, in a couple of cases that we are dealing with, the murders took place in this jurisdiction. And one of the things that we've begun to explore is meeting with the guards. First of all, what we did was that we wrote to the then Minister for Justice and the Garda Commissioner, both of whom have now changed, of course, and they referred us to the cold case unit in the Guards. And we've had quite a positive engagement in relation to 2 cases, which has provided us with more information, because, of course, there is going to be a Garda file down here. And at the very least, the possibility of a re-examination of that or a review of that may provide some more information. And as we understand it, the Guards are able to go to the north and ask for information from the PSNI. So that might be something that's worth looking at. We're not convinced that they get much cooperation. And I think the Guards have a certain way to go in terms of providing information, but certainly we've received a very good response in relation to that. So that's something that's worth bearing in mind in relation to conflict-related deaths in this jurisdiction. The other thing I wanted to say is just to thank Brendan, Deputy Smith, for your kind words and the support. I mean, I think it can sometimes be very thankless work, this work. And I think all the support that we get is very much appreciated, and it does help the families that we represent to know that legislators in this place are interested in the issues at the heart of their cases. So I think one of the most important things is continued interest. I should say that recently there's been quite a transformation in the environment in relation to dealing with the relatives of victims. There used to be the Pat Finucane Centre and ourselves, but there are now, through European peace funding, the Peace 4 round of funding, there are now some 25 advocacy workers funded through the Victims and Survivors Service. And of course, Peace 4 funding is partly supported by the Irish government as well. So some of the resources paying for our salaries and the salaries of the other organisations. So I mean, it might be of interest for you to look at the other organisations and see what they're doing. Some of them would be operating more on the loyalist side, and they'll be developing their capacity. It certainly, the idea was that because the HIU and the ICE, the Independent Commission on Information Recovery, was supposed to be up and running, these extra resources were supposed to be available for families to get support in engaging with the new institutions. Now, of course, the funding's come through. All these organisations are now operating, and yet the institutions aren't up and running. So it's a bit of a mismatch, which is a shame. But it may be of interest for the committee to explore that area of work. And then finally, I was just going to, whenever Anne was talking about does the Minister for Foreign Affairs strike the desk when he's talking to his British counterparts, I was quite amused recently when I was researching some of the original shoot-to-kill cases in 1982. And I discovered in the Irish Times at the time that eventually, as a result of the prosecution of an RUC man in respect of one of those cases, it emerged that an RUC unit had crossed the border to Castle Blaney and were tracking the activities of an INLA group in Castle Blaney and monitoring them in this jurisdiction without so much as a by or leave from the Gardaí. And Garrett Fitzgerald was mightily unimpressed, and he carpeted the British ambassador, and it says in the Irish Times, who was forced to give an abject apology. Now, sometimes we'd like to see an abject apology on behalf of the British in relation to the activities around legacy, but it may be that refreshing the minds of the government as to how they acted in the past might be something that's worth doing from time to time. I understand that cooperation is far better than argument, but sometimes cooperation doesn't get us very far with the British government in relation to this. But I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to come down and talk to you, and I certainly hope that we can continue the relationship. Thank you very much.
And you wanted to say something?
Well, just very finally, I don't want this to be one long whinge from this side of the table. We are making progress, and there's absolutely no doubt about it. The truth is gradually being dragged out, piece by piece. Families won't give up. We won't give up. And we are making significant progress through low cunning sometimes, through tenacity, because of families. We are going forward. We're not stationary, and we're certainly not going backwards. We are going forward, and we will continue to go forward.
Thanks very much for that. And just
finally, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed for having us here today, and thanks to everybody.
thanks. Just on behalf of the committee, we'd like to thank yourselves for coming in, and also to say that I suppose we do feel that everybody on all sides does need to see justice and does need to see truth, and it's unacceptable to us that people have had to campaign for so long just to get information. It is a topic that we are focusing on now. We had a lot of focus, as you can imagine, in relation to Brexit earlier in the year and last year, but we are focusing on legacy, and as I said earlier, this is the first of a series of meetings. So what we plan to do is have those meetings and then as a committee decide on what actions we're going to take. But certainly some of the things that you've raised, Margaret, in relation to reinstating those meetings with party leaders and about the letter that was sent, as I understand it, there is some work going on with Department of Foreign Affairs, that we can check that kind of stuff and come back to you. But just to say, we do plan to have all of the meetings first and then come back to people and see where we're going with it, just to be fair to everybody involved. And just to, again, very sincere thanks, and to everybody that came down that's also in the public gallery. It's not an easy task for families, and we do appreciate you coming in. So thank you. Yeah.
I made a suggestion that we would write as a committee to the Secretary of State, Mr Brokenshire. Is that agreed, is it?
Yeah, I don't think there's any issue with that. Yeah. And also, we do have the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly is meeting in Liverpool on Sunday, and myself, Deputy Smith, Deputy Brannock are all members of that, so we can try and maybe...
Could I also say, and I suppose nobody has raised the Dublin Monaghan bombings in the Dáil as much as myself over the years, because my constituency is Cavan Monaghan. Margaret and her colleagues would have had a meeting with the then Foreign Affairs Minister Charlie Flanagan, and Deputy Sean Crowe, Deputy Maureen Sullivan, myself had a meeting, I think it was the same day. And I have to say, Minister Flanagan was very much engaged on the subject, to be fair to him. And so the senior officials who were with him, including our now Ambassador, Adrian O'Neill, to Britain, he was with them, and they were very engaged on the subject. That was my feeling from the meeting. In fairness, that day was very good engagement from our point of view, and they were forthcoming with us on the entire issue. I think, to be fair to Minister Flanagan, I want to put that on the record. It's not my business to defend the government. I'm an opposition TD, but I want to be fair to Minister Flanagan and Adrian O'Neill, Ambassador Adrian O'Neill, and their colleagues who were with them that day as well. And we want to keep that pressure on to ensure that the best possible pressure is put on the British government, and that we don't want it to be an item for an agenda just to be ticked off. Absolutely not. And that's all of our wishes.
And just to say as well that we do actually have the Minister for Foreign Affairs coming in the next number of weeks, probably around the end of November, so hopefully we'll have had a series of these meetings and we can bring some of these issues to him as well. So
a meeting with the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Obviously we haven't met him before.
Yeah, okay. Well, again, thank you all very much, and obviously we'll be in touch about the different issues, but thank you. So the meeting is adjourned until 26th of October at 2:15. Okay.